Good morning, everyone. Welcome. A very, very warm welcome to everybody to the official opening of the Gender Justice in Disaster Inspiring Action Conference. We're calling it a virtual conference in 4 parts, and here we are today at the step of part 4, the official opening of our conference. My name's Helen Riseborough, and I'm the CEO of Women's Health in the North, one of Victoria's women's health services here in Australia. And I have a very privileged position today of introducing and opening this conference for all of us. As our first piece of business in commencing the conference this morning, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the wisdom, living culture and unique role of the traditional custodians of these unceded lands on which we're meeting. Regardless of where we are in Australia, we are on the lands of Aboriginal people, the custodians of this country. Today, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to the First Nations people of all the countries represented at this conference, the elders past and present, and to any First Nations people who are joining us today and for the rest of the conference over the course of the month. I'm privileged to open this important conference on behalf of the Gender and Disaster Pod, a partnership between Women's Health Goulburn North East, Monash University's Disaster Resilience Initiative, together with Women's Health in the North. We've been blessed with a committed and hard-working conference organising group. And boy, you'll see the hard work as the conference progresses throughout the course of the month of May. And the organising group was made up of the following people who I'd like to thank very much for their incredible work. The manager of the GAD-Pod, Dr. Deb Parkinson, our research and training coordinator, Jaspreet Kaur, Women's Health Goulburn North East's CEO, Amanda Kelly, Monash University's Emeritus Professor Frank Archer, and colleagues Steve O'Malley from Fire Rescue Victoria and Daryl Taylor from Bioculture. Thank you all for making this conference a reality. Obviously, people will see that the conference will come into being in a few minutes with the beginning, with our first session very shortly. May I also thank a couple of other very supportive sponsors of our conference. Amanda Leck, the Executive Director, and her team at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, that's AIDA for short, and the Women and Firefighting Australasia, that's WAFA for short, 2 organisations who are supporting partners of the conference. And I've been asked by the organisers to alert you to the generous donation and offer made by AIDA in sponsoring the conference, some conference places, which some are still available. So if you know someone who would like to benefit from a sponsored place at the conference, please contact our conference organiser, the wonderful Leanne from Happenings Australia, and she'll organise it for you. Well, we have a most impressive lineup of speakers and presentations for you over the course of the coming month. The program's a wonderful mix of the intersection of issues, people, organisations and sectors, all playing a part in bringing a gender lens to critical issues of disaster and contemporary emergency management. We're building on the Diversity in Disaster Conference, which was held in 2018. That was an in-person conference here in Melbourne. At this conference, we have leaders, researchers, community members, activists, academics, emergency service and community organisations, all bringing unique perspectives and insights to the important issues of gender, emergencies, climate change, intersectionality, representation, Aboriginal land management, discrimination, women in leadership, and violence against women and children. So you can see it's a pretty incredibly packed conference program. We're proud to share a values base with you, taking action for justice and equity for all people and communities. I'm looking forward to enjoying the stimulation of the forthcoming conference program over the next month and to the ideas and the thinking which will bring action and activism from here on. And I hope you're as excited as I am by wanting to participate in the program as we go forward. So Tuesday mornings and Tuesday afternoons and Thursday mornings will be very much around being at this conference, and I'm sure we'll all get so much from it. So please enjoy it. And I'm now pleased to hand over to Leonard, who is going to moderate the very first session of the conference this morning. Thanks very much, everyone.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be introducing the first session of the conference. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm placed today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which all of us are joining in today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who are here today. Thank you for joining us for today's session, which is on gender equality, diversity and systemic change within the emergency services sector. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our panel, whose full bios can be referenced in the conference program. This is the list of speakers, and the list that I'm giving you is the list in which they will appear. There's Professor Guðný Eydal, who's from the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Iceland. Donna Stolzenberg, founder of the National Homelessness Collection and Victorian recipient of Australian of the Year for 2021. Arjan Cheema, Australian Red Cross Senior Project Officer in Recovery Emergency Services. Stuart Ellis, who is CEO of the Australasian Fire and Emergency Service Authorities Council. And Lucy Saaroni, who's Executive Manager Fire Prevention and Preparedness for the CFA. The panel will be offering insights from their respective organisations on what emergency services can do to achieve gender equality, diversity and systemic change as we continue to face the increasing threat of ever more disasters. Now, I welcome you to engage with our panellists by placing questions in the Q&A feature, which in my computer is at the bottom of the screen and not in the chat box. And we'll return to those questions, hopefully, if we have time at the end of the presentations. And I think Vanessa, who will be managing the technical side, will put up some directions for you in your chat box around how to actually lodge your questions. So I'd like to introduce our first panellist, who is actually joining us from Iceland via a pre-recorded video message. That's Professor Guðný Eydal, but I believe that Guðný is actually also online at the moment if she can stay awake. Guðný has just completed 2 weighty reports in the role of local services in the Nordic countries, that's Norway, Finland, Iceland, Sweden and Denmark. And her presentation will be looking at both of these reports. The first is looking at the links between disaster management and the social services sector in the Nordic countries. And the second is a report on the outcomes of Iceland's parental paid leave scheme. So if I hand over to Vanessa to get us onto the video, thanks.
Hello all, let me start by sharing my screen. My name is Guðný Eydal and I am a professor at the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Iceland. And I'm going to say a few words to you about 2 projects that we've been conducting here in Iceland and in a Nordic context called the Nordic Welfare Watch. And I'm recording this from Reykjavik, where, as you might have heard, we have a recent volcano erupting in our backyard, only 25 miles from Reykjavik. So this is our view on a clear night. We can see the light from the volcano very clearly. Well, let me first talk a little bit about the project on the role of the social services in times of disasters. As you know, all the Nordic countries have well-established emergency management systems, but they also are known for their extensive welfare systems, where local social services are important component, where they have the role of ensuring social security to all in times of need. And we were curious to know if those 2 big systems did really cooperate and how they were there doing that. And we start by asking if local social services have a formal role in the contingency planning of the emergency management system in the 5 Nordic countries. And we don't have to say this in many words. The picture speaks for themselves. We know that both these systems are highly gendered, even though it's slowly changing. And we also know from the literature how important the social services are in times of disasters in all the phases in regards to emergency management. And we know that they are especially important for groups with special needs and vulnerable groups of all kinds. So the social services are of vital importance. And the results show us that we have a little bit mixed systems, if you like, in the Nordic countries. While all the countries have legal requirements for social services to prepare contingency planning, it's only in Finland and Norway where the law specifically address the role of the local services during times of disasters. And we asked both about the Emergency Management Acts and the Social Service Acts. And furthermore, there are only specific guidelines for the social services to do the contingency, how to do the contingency planning in 3 out of 5 countries. So neither Denmark nor Iceland has such specific guidelines. So we still have a way to go. And this is very much a work in progress. That is how to systemize the cooperation of these 2 large systems that should actually work quite closely in times of disasters together. And for example, we are now working on an article about the response of the systems in the first wave of COVID in regards to elderly care. And we see that there's a lot lacking in terms of the full involvement of the social services. And for example, in Iceland, the concept of social services is not even mentioned in the long contingency pandemic plan. So here we have a lot to do, and more communication between those huge big systems would obviously enhance gender equality in the long run. We also have another project on the Icelandic law on paid parental leave, where it's the aim of the legislator to enhance increased role of fathers in care of their children. And we got this law in the year 2000, and they gave each parent 3 months' rights to paid parental leave, and then they have 3 months which they can share as they like. And the payment is 80% of previous salaries. If we look at the take-up, we see that in 2001, we gave the fathers 1 month, in 2002, 2 months, and 2003, 3 months. And we see that they are using, on average, all their entitlements and better. So they took up to 101 days, but after the crisis, when there were cuts in the benefit level, the number of days got a little bit lower. The average days used by mothers have not moved that much at all, and they usually use their entitlements plus the joint entitlements. And we have also made repeated surveys among parents of all firstborns in order to learn how they divide the care and the work between themselves. And we asked them about the first years in their children's life. And in this picture, we see how the parents divided the care of their child during the first 36 months of their life. And we see here this dotted line that shows us the percentage of children that were cared for mainly or only by mothers. And we see it's very high during the first months, and then it gradually becomes lower, but it never exceeds the numbers of, or the percentage of parents that divide the care equally, because that only gets up to 40%, while 60% are here cared for only by the mothers. And the dotted line here is the proportion of children cared for by fathers, and it's hardly visible. And then the law come into force, and we see, when we measure this in 2003 born children, that the picture has changed quite dramatically. And we also see that there is a statistically significant difference between the fathers that do take paid parental leave and those who do not. Those who do are caring much more for the children than those who do not. And we see that even here at the age of 14 months, the proportion of children cared for equally by both parents exceeds the proportion of children cared for only by mothers. And this development continues. And by each measurement, we see how the proportion of children cared for by both parents is growing. And it's now above 70% of all children at the age of 3. And we also see that the shift is happening much earlier than in previous measurements. And this allows us to conclude that parents are dividing the care of the young children more equally after the law came into effect. And the fathers are taking much more active part in the care of their children during the first 3 years. We also see that parents' working hours and labour market participation has become more equal. We ask about that as well in the service. And we also, I could add, have now new law from 2020, where each parent is given 6 months long leave, and they can transfer 6 weeks to each other. So we will measure how that results in terms of care. So just to conclude, I do it by one sentence. What is constructed can be transformed. And as a representative for that statement, I present here Karin Óla, a young Icelandic female who is working on a fishing boat, and in her spare times she participates in the voluntary rescue teams, and here she is close to this new volcano with her gas mask because there are dangerous gases coming from the volcano, and she is here standing on call to rescue people and support those who are visiting the volcano by walking. And I'm sure that we will see step by step good moves towards gender equality, and that this conference will help us all defining the best ways to go there. Thank you.
Thank you, Guðný. We're going to go fairly quickly through just because the times of presentation are fairly tight. So I'd like to introduce our second speaker, who is Donna Stolzenberg. Donna is a proud Indigenous woman and CEO of the National Homeless Collective. Donna is Victoria's Current Australian of the Year in recognition, a Victorian nomination for Current Australian of the Year, in recognition of her work on behalf of women and children during Australia's Black Summer bushfires and the lockdown of a number of public housing towers in Melbourne following an outbreak of COVID-19. For those of you who don't know, the lockdowns involved about 3,000 people being confined under police guard to their units in 9 tower blocks for nearly 2 weeks in July 2020. The residents were given no notice, meaning many people were left without food or medicine. So over to you, Donna.
Thank you, Liam. It's wonderful to be here. Yes, I'd like to speak to the work that we did in initially the bushfires in 2020. In Victoria, we woke up first day of the year and the state was pretty much on fire. And one of the things that we noticed was that the provision of sanitary items for those people who were stranded in places like Malakuta Beach and small towns where the SES and fire brigade were going into, no one had really thought about we thought about the provision of food and water, but not about the sanitary items for menstruating people. So our charity put together over, I think, 7,000 packs of sanitary items that were then taken through with the SES and right through Queensland, New South Wales, ACT, Victoria, wherever the fires pretty much were. And then a few months later, when we had the tower lockdowns here in Melbourne, and Melbourne had a very prolonged, significant stage 4 lockdown right across Victoria, and in particular Melbourne City itself. But with the sudden lockdown of the towers, what had happened there was that the teams hadn't really taken into consideration that the care of the children, that the mental load of that fell onto mostly the mothers, the females. And given that those that were in charge were mostly male, they hadn't considered items like infant formula, nappies, access to sanitation for bottles, and the care of breastfeeding mothers. And we went down to the towers, being our charity was an essential service. So what we also found was people reached out to us through Facebook groups, desperate for something to feed their babies. And even though food had been thought of, infant formula hadn't really been thought of. In particular, those infants who were on a specific type of formula, who couldn't just have regular cow's milk or needed, some kind of specific milk just for them. So people started to reach out to us on Facebook, and I think we distributed, it was over about 20,000 nappies over the course of the lockdown, 600 tins of formula. There were about 7,000 sanitary bags. We had the other problem that we had too was when we took the items in. Of course, we were not allowed into the towers because there was such a high incidence of COVID-19 amongst the residents. But when we got there, the emergency relief teams on the ground hadn't factored into their logistics that our goods would be arriving. So they had a section for food and for other emergency supplies, but when we got there, they just said, we don't know where to put this. We haven't thought of nappies. We haven't thought of formula. We don't know where it's going to go. And in the end, we had to take it into where the food storage was. So it was a multifaceted failure of looking after the needs of the infants. And the lockdown continued quite some time after the towers where people were released, because people did have COVID-19 in the towers. Some families did. So the whole family was locked in, and we found that it was probably a good 3 months before we saw that an alleviation of the need for the products that we were giving. So it was infant care products, but also what we found was that the families were in desperate need of items to entertain the children as well. Living in a unit, not able to use playground equipment right across Melbourne, people not able to use elevators and stairs or any communal areas. So we also produced I think it was about 600 play bags for children that had some general items in just to keep them busy. And that it just hadn't been factored into those emergency relief efforts. People sort of, I think, mainly thought about food and that was it, and not the care of the infants that mainly fell on the mothers. So I think we operated for about, it was about 3 months all up, doing that through, with National Homeless Collective. And that's about my 5 minutes, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna. Our next speaker is Arjan Cheema. Arjan is the Senior Project Officer of Recovery Emergency Services with the Australian Red Cross. And Arjan will be looking at one of the point of differences with the Red Cross to other emergency services, which is the number of women actually working for the agency. And he'll also be talking about some of the ways in which the Red Cross is promoting gender parity within the emergency response sector. So over to you, Arjan.
Thanks so much, Liam, and thanks for having me here today. I think before I talk a bit about Red Cross's emergency services and the work we do on gender and diversity, I wanted to briefly talk a little bit about the topic at hand today. And I think when we think about gender equality, diversity and systemic change, I think we need to think about this in the most broad and inclusive way possible. And so this means looking at how our workforces show equality, diversity and inclusion across various groups. So we should always be considering how we approach equality and diversity in representation of women, men, but also LGBTQI+ groups, First Nations peoples, people with disabilities, culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And I think that's something that's quite important for us to consider, to be informed about, and to work towards in our operations across the board. So I think that's something that we should sort of keep in mind when we're having these conversations about diversity, gender equality and inclusion. So I think one of the perhaps one of the main, I guess, unique parts of Red Cross as an emergency service organisation is our gender equality and diversity breakdown. And when we take a step back and look at some of the statistics for both our staff and volunteers, we actually have around 70+% women or people who identify as women in our workforce, and then about 25% who identify as men. And I think this gender breakdown is quite interesting because it does come with its opportunities, but it also does come with its challenges. So I think as far as the opportunities go, we have some incredible people working within our organisation and volunteering for us who bring a great diversity into our view or our insights and into our view of the world. And I think it holds us in very good stead by having this diverse group of people representing us to be able to empathise and to really understand the needs of the community that we're working with, and to bring in different lenses when we are trying to understand the needs of communities that we're supporting. And that's quite an important aspect, I think, Red Cross bring into the emergency services sector as a bit of a point of difference. I think also Red Cross have quite good gender policies that are endorsed from senior management as well as our board. And we have our like papers on gender and disaster management guidelines, which help guide what are some of the things that we should and do consider before, during and after an emergency. And I think that's sort of led to a culture of understanding more about gender equality and putting that at the forefront when we do engage in our emergency services work. And I think that sort of the policy side extends beyond just gender. We also have our reconciliation action plan for our First Nations peoples and colleagues. So I think having these policies and guidelines in place help us frame our thinking in a way that's inclusive and diverse before we start sort of planning or doing operations. But I suppose all of this being said, we, like I said, have quite a few challenges. So I think while we have that strong gender balance, it is quite a homogenous group of like that represent each of these groups, and I think that's quite normal to see in a Red Cross national society like the Australian Red Cross. But I think it's really important that we sort of keep working and focusing on fostering and promoting greater diversity and mainstreaming diversity within our organisation and in our emergency services sector. I also think fostering women in leadership is something that we do well, but I think there's an opportunity to do it better. We do have quite a number of women in leadership positions in our emergency services team and across the organisation, but I think it's something that we need to keep focusing on, especially if our organisation has such a strong female group or contingent within it. And I think a part of that also, I guess, builds another opportunity is for greater engagement of men in our work. And I think that's something that really is something we can do a lot more on. And I'll talk a bit about it in a second, about, I suppose, why we have that, the gender balance that we have at the moment. But another thing within the organisation, I think we're still sort of grappling with and working with, I'm sure a lot of organisations are those existing gender assumptions or stereotyping of the role that a woman or a man or certain people should be playing in the space. And I think we see it play out during our emergency work. So when, you know, you get the big heavy bags, it's like, oh, the man should go get that, but without having that conversation or engaging with someone who's just as capable, whether they're someone who's older or someone who's so from a diverse or different background. So I think these are sort of the assumptions that we need to start to check ourselves on constantly to sort of bring about some change. So I guess moving on to looking at the role of Red Cross in emergency services and disaster management, I think one of the major issues that I've talked about with some of my colleagues is that I think Red Cross often struggle for legitimacy in the space. And I think one of the driving forces of this is that we're not generally seen as a traditional combat agency. Like, we don't go out sort of fighting fires or cleaning roads or rebuilding fences or infrastructure. We've sort of differentiated ourselves a lot in that we focus in on supporting people on psychosocial support and that long-term community-led resilience and recovery. And so I think often these roles in emergencies can become quite gendered. So, you know, the whole physical get stuff done, you know, clean up and all of that, make people safe, sort of falls on the man's role, and the caring of people and checking in on people's mental and physical health can sort of be seen as a women's role. And we fall into these sort of gender stereotypes quite often, and I think a lot of the research reflects that, in that it shows that during an emergency there is that reversion back to traditional gender norms. And I think that's something that we as a sector need to sort of think about. And so I guess while it's common for communities to fall into these this reversion to traditional gender norms, I think as agencies we really need to recognize that before, during and after emergencies, we don't fall into these roles. We sort of have these conversations beforehand. We have an informed workforce so that when we sit at the table together, when we're supporting each other, we're not gendering ourselves or our organizations. So I guess, you know, with time running out, I just wanted to kind of say that there are so many policies and procedures that you can put in place, but I think to really create change is to have like a management that is empowering to and understand equality, and also having a cultural change. Now that'll be different for all organizations, but I think to engage in education, to connect with organizations like the GAD pod, to come and have a chat with the workforce, or to get the Australasian Women in Emergencies networks and others to join in that conversation and to push it forward within the workforce, I think is a really important step forward to sort of creating that change.
Thank you, Arjan. That's sort of a good lead in really to Stuart. Stuart Ellis is the CEO of the Australian Fire and Emergency Services Authorities Council, AFAC, which you can see behind Stuart. He'll be looking at some of the ways in which deeply ingrained sort of male focus and lens continues to structure the work of emergency services, including how it frames things like sexual violence and sexual assault as women's issues. So I'll hand over to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Liam, and good morning to everyone, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak about these important issues. I think from a fire and emergency perspective, we're putting increasing focus on our language, because in these major disasters, we've identified that we can't put out the fires or stop the floods or cyclones, but we can put out the information, and there's a greater reliance on us putting out information, and we've now got a national warning system which we are rolling out across the country with consistent warnings and so on. And so that just made me focus on language to a degree. And this commentary is not just about fire and emergency services, but it's more general, that I think with issues to do with gender and domestic violence, just a term like that, it's a very passive term. We're not talking about men being violent to women. We talk about pay equity. We don't talk about men paying men more than women. Or it can be more severe. In the most severe forms of violence, we talk about a woman being raped, not a man raping a woman. And I think this passive view is just distorting our thinking and perhaps men's responsibility for the issues, because I think really the treatment of women and ensuring there is justice is a men's issue. It's men that tend to dictate the environment, and certainly in fire and emergency services, it's a very conservative environment. It has been, from a firefighter perspective, a very male-dominated environment. We've recognised this. We've joined Champions of Change, and we have Kristen Hilton, the Victorian Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commissioner, as our convener, who seeks to keep us honest with making progress. But that progress is slow, and so that's also led me to reflect, how committed are we to making change in this space? Because I think the issues are very apparent to us all. The appalling violence to women in society, we hear it almost every week. And I think the firefighting community are role models. They're people who are well respected, and we all appreciate support from firefighters when we need help. And so I think firefighters have a particular responsibility here to advocate and to articulate clearly what the issues are through our language. So that's, if I could go on. Workplace harassment is almost entirely men harassing women in the workplace, but we sort of shield these actions in a gender neutral commentary, and I think that's very unhelpful. So I'm keen to see us be more upfront with our language, for fire and emergency personnel to show greater commitment, because I think that's really vital. And because information has become so critical in responding to emergencies, I think that our language, as well as our actions, need to resonate with all of the community, not just 50% of the community. And so that's why it is vitally important for us to make these changes. So I'm agitating for change in the fire and emergency space, not only for behaviour, but for language as well. And I think opportunities like this to talk about these issues and share the ideas is really important. Thanks, Liam.
Thank you, Stuart. I'd like to hand over now to our final speaker, who's Lucy Saaroni, who's Executive Manager, Fire Prevention and Preparedness at the CFA. And I think Lucy's going to be looking at issues around gender equity and how the CFA is beginning to address diversity more broadly and moving to reflect the diversity of the communities that it serves. So over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Liam. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to come today and speak to you. I just want to recognise that I'm actually speaking to you from my home, which is on the lands traditionally owned by the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And on behalf of CFA, I pay my respects to those people and their elders, past and present. For those who aren't familiar with the Country Fire Authority, we're a pretty large community-based, volunteer-based fire and emergency services, and we've been in operation since 1945. So the CFA supports over 3 million Victorians, more than 1 million homes and properties across the state to essentially be better prepared for and safer from fire. So we service the community through a network of over 1,200 stations, and we do everything from fire response, complex rescues and road crashes, chemical incidences, and of course all the inherent engagement work that we do with communities to support them in preparing for fires and preventing fires where they can. In our organisation, I think it's really important that we recognise that we've got a commitment to providing a welcoming and inclusive and a really safe place to volunteer and work. And we acknowledge that CFA has a long way to go to achieve a gender balance and to increase the diversity that's going to accurately reflect and better reflect the population that we serve. So it's a pretty big journey, you know, that we're on, and it's taking place through a range of programs and initiatives. But I suppose the most important starting point for us is acknowledging where we're coming from. So we're coming from a place that has a really long history, a really rich customs and traditions and language and infrastructure that has historically been quite gender divisive rather than a place of gender equity and gender inclusivity in its culture. So starting at that point of recognition and acknowledgement that the way we've been shaped as an employer, as employees, we have barriers that we need to get rid of to ensure more equitable representation of those we serve in leadership and decision-making roles, in our planning. You know, Arjan talked about the importance of networks. One of the things that CFA is doing to get us to where we want to get to in terms of increasing gender equity and diversity in our workplace is establishing a lot of networks to provide a safe space for women, for example, people with different sexual backgrounds as well, to come and speak and work together and identify issues and put forward solutions and partner with others to help make that happen. So we've got networking and support groups for young people. We've got an LGBTIQ network. We've got activities that take place like women's burn camps that create a safe space, again, for women to come and do training and undertake kind of professional development in a place where they're going to be really supported and their needs specifically are going to be addressed and met. There's also a recognition of the specific value that's unique to women that they can bring to CFA. Yes, I think, you know, every section of the community comes with its own needs and challenges, but they also come with their own values. So it's recognising that and leveraging off that as well that's going to make us as an organisation a better place to work and a better service. So an example that I can talk about is the Catamatite Fire Brigade. So they, historically, they were really struggling to cope with the weekday daytime emergencies because they didn't have a lot of volunteers. As I mentioned, it's a volunteer organisation. So the captain held a number of community sessions essentially targeting stay-at-home mums and women working part-time in the area to join the brigade. So we had 6 women sign up and 4 are still really heavily involved in, and this has been going on for nearly 20 years, I think now. So we have, of the women that signed up, you know, they've become operational. They've joined the brigade management team. Initially, they were trained in wildfire fighting. They've expanded on their skill levels and they've completed training in low structure fires, road crash rescues as crew leaders, and the brigade is stronger for it. You know, we've got a level of capability that we wouldn't have had we not sought out that specific cohort recognise them for the capacity that they've got that we can't get elsewhere. So Stuart talked about the language. Language is super important for us, not only the language that we provide out to our community, but the language we use within our own organisation. Some of the work that we're doing around that includes the policy revision. We're also doing training courses that we make available to members, including inclusion foundations. We've got disability confidence, LGBTIQ awareness and ally training. So it's really about also shaping our policy and informing it with the latest data. So with the Gender Equality Act that's recently been released, we're looking at developing a refreshed diversity inclusion strategy to assist us with implementing that act and the requirements under that act. So, you know, it's a complex matter that we want to change our culture around. It's not just language, it's not just networks, it's not just policy, it's not just our team structure, it's not even just our infrastructure, it's all of these things working together. And I think, you know, just thinking about what Donna was talking about earlier, you know, it's about hooking into these community groups and listening to them, learning from them, to understand what it is that we can improve on. So yeah, I'll leave it there unless there are any specific questions that you wanted to ask.
Thank you. Thank you to the five speakers. It strikes me that collectively you've all moved from very broad-based issues, discussed organisational issues, and also moved down to some real initiatives on the ground. I'm going to go with some of the questions that are on the Q&A board, knowing that we only have about 7 or 8 minutes. So the first question, which is really quite broad, I thought if I could address that perhaps to Stuart and Arjan, just because it's at an organisational level. This person is saying there's been a lot of talk about fostering and promoting women, and yet we constantly see women short-circuited and leaving our emergency services because they aren't really supported. And they ask, when are our land emergency services going to put their actions where their mouths are? So I suppose this is referring to that despite all of this discussion around gender equity, we're still seeing women not supported and women leaving these emergency services.
Yeah, thanks very much. I might kick off. Look, it's a real challenge for us. There's no question about that. And I mean, I think the positive thing is, if I can say so, we are talking about it. But even within our Champions of Change network, which is the chiefs and commissioners from around the country, a number of which are women, they are particularly frustrated, I think, that we're not moving fast enough. I think we've probably got to focus on the positives and where there are strengths. And Fire and Rescue New South Wales, for instance, which is a big career organisation, one of the biggest in the country, is making some significant inroads into increasing the number of women. So that's a good example for us all. But there's other agencies around the country which really haven't moved, and our worst representation, I think, is a little more than 3% in firefighters. So I think we've really got to put the acid and the responsibility on the leadership and the workforce to make change, because it's not going to happen by itself. And hopefully opportunities like this help present that challenge to us. But I'll leave some time for Arjan.
Thanks, Stuart. So yeah, I think just quickly, when this question got posed, I was thinking a little bit about what I was reflecting on in terms of having a strong management that understand the needs and requirements of all people. And so that can mean, like Professor Guðný was talking about, the paternity and maternity leave, but really understanding what those needs are and being able to sort of advocate and implement them in an organisation and a policy level, but then having that understanding to be flexible around what those needs are, whether it's sort of flexible in terms of time people start working and that sort of thing. So I think that's where it really begins, is to have that strong leadership and taking that empathy and understanding into those conversations.
Thank you, Arjan. This question's for Donna. Somebody asks, what would have helped, do you think, the people in the towers, and what could be done differently if it happened again? And I also wanted you to reflect on how an organisation that was initially delivery focused, have you become an advocacy organisation increasingly because of your experience in working at the towers and the bushfires?
To address that part first, Liam, yes, we have become an advocacy organisation as well. If you look into our history, we started 6 years ago just delivering sleeping bags, and now we're a national organisation that supports all sorts of people in all sorts of situations, mainly homelessness, but also those experiencing domestic abuse as well, and people in hardship. And we do a lot of advocacy work now to have especially work laws and rules changed so that people who are experiencing homelessness and hardship can still have a place in the workforce without the threat or thought of being fired because they can't start and finish at the same time as everyone else can. But to go back to the question, something that that Stuart actually mentioned, which was that critical information sharing, and what we found in particular with the lockdown of the towers, because it was so sudden, that there was a very large communication gap between all services. So, and also something Arjan spoke to as well about the legitimacy of the organisation. And what we found was that the governments tend to go straight to the larger organisations, the well-known ones, who perhaps haven't modified much over the last 30 odd years to focus, to be able to hone in and focus on those smaller target groups that weren't addressed before. So what would have helped would have been a plug-in service where all of the organisations could look at what everyone else is doing, what's already been addressed, a key person to speak to, where we found communication was incredibly difficult when we were trying to support the people in the towers, and also work out, are we doubling up? Is anyone already doing this? Has someone already got this? And to have a plug-in service where all services, including those grassroots charities, to have the legitimacy of those groups, and a service where we could all speak and connect in together and work out who was doing what and what else still needed to be done.
Thank you, Donna. We have time, perhaps one more question. I was going to direct this to Guðný if you're up for answering a question. Or you talked initially about the distinction between having the cooperation between social services and disaster management being enshrined in legislation in 2 of the Nordic countries. And then you talked about some just having guidelines. What are the strengths and weaknesses of those 2 different approaches, do you think? Do you think legislation is more powerful, or do you think sometimes that can actually be contradictory?
I actually think you need both. I think the legislation is extremely important, but the guidelines and the understanding of the need is obviously very important. But let me just, since I got the word, just say that, because someone asked if you could follow the footsteps of the Nordic countries and take up the father's quota, I would say yes, you can, but also at the same time, if anyone can, it's Australia, because you have somehow mastered this, like Stuart was explaining, how you see through the language and how you deconstruct in order to seek for the roots, and you have this strong culture of forgiveness and understanding and coming to terms with your history and inequalities, and you are addressing things. So I think the Nordic nations have so much to learn from you. So we should have more dialogues between ourselves, even though it's this huge time difference. So I hope we can continue this discussion, and I thank all the fellow panelists for their
very educating talks. Thank you all.
All right, I think we're pretty much out of time. I'd like to thank really our fantastic panelists. That's Guðný, Donna, Arjan, Stuart, and Lucy. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined the session, and I've been asked to ask you to complete the quick survey when you leave the session. So thank you all very much for a fabulous session.